Redux might seem complex, but in this video we're going to break it down into simple concepts and learn everything you need to know about Redux to start using it in your own projects. And along the way, we'll even make a cool scorekeeping app which utilizes every feature of Redux you need to know, including working with APIs. But before we get started, we need to understand why we need it in the first place. Your React application probably looks something like this: a bunch of components with nested children. Each component has its own data called state and passes it to its children via props. Now this is okay for a small project, but in bigger projects your tree can look something like this. And managing and passing data between components can get complex and messy. This is where Redux comes in. It's one of the most popular libraries and patterns for managing data in the front end. It stores the data for your entire application in an object called the store. This store is global, so any component can write to it and any component can read from it. And the way Redux is set up, any component which uses data from the store gets automatically updated whenever any data changes. And Redux Toolkit is a library which makes it super easy to get it set up for your application. So let's quickly go over how Redux works. At the center of Redux is the store, where your entire application state is stored. The store can be broken up into multiple slices. You might have a user slice where details about your current user are stored, and a separate cart slice with details about the products in their cart. Think of the store like a database, and a slice is like a table inside that database. This store supplies data to the UI, which renders it and shows it to the user. Whenever you interact with the UI, such as by clicking a button, it dispatches an action which tells Redux that you want to modify the store. Think of it like a messenger between your UI and Redux. The action that gets sent consists of two fields. Firstly, there's a type which is predefined by you, such as add to cart or remove from cart. And this lets Redux know what kind of operation you want to do. And then the second field is a payload, which is an object containing any data related to the operation. This will make more sense once we actually work on the implementation. And lastly is the reducer. Now the store is immutable, which means that it can't be modified directly. So what the action does is that it triggers a corresponding reducer, which takes in the previous version of the store, modifies it based on the payload you sent in your action, and stores the new version of the store. Now once the reducer has modified the store, this data gets sent to every component in your UI and this entire cycle repeats. This ensures your changes get applied globally and you don't have to worry about passing data around along all the components. Now that we have a basic understanding of Redux, let's get started with the code. Over here we have a simple React application and we'll be going through this and adding Redux step by step and adding some functionality to it. Firstly, we have the scored component which you see on the left hand side over here, and the purpose of this is basically to be able to click on the plus and minus buttons to change this number here. And then when we click on submit, this number should clear out and then it should be added to the history over here as another card on top. Now, if you were implementing this just by using the React state, what you would do is inside app.tsx, you would probably add a stateful variable at the top and then you would pass it in as a prop to both of these components. And then you'd also create functions to modify this variable and pass it into both of these components. And for a small application like this, you could do it, but as the application grows in size, you would probably need to add Redux. So to get started with that, we'll firstly stop running our application and we'll write down npm install at redux.js/toolkit. And you can install this for either an Angular application, a Vue application, anything you want. But in this case, we're doing it for a React application. And this is the Redux toolkit, and it helps us set up Redux for our application in a few simple steps. So let's just get it started up again. So we'll run npm run dev. And the first thing, if you remember, is that we need to set up a store which actually stores all of the data. So we'll come to the src folder and create a file called store.ts. Now I am using TypeScript in this tutorial, but if you're using JavaScript, don't worry, most of the stuff will be the same, and I'll let you know if you need to change anything. So inside the store file, what we'll do is create the store for our Redux. So we'll say export const store, and we'll say is equal to configure store. And this is a function imported from Redux toolkit. And what it takes in is a definition of the different slices that we'll have inside our store. It takes in an object, and the only field we need to define is the reducer field. So later on, we'll be making all of the reducers for our application, and we'll be supplying them over here. But for now, we'll leave it empty. So we'll save that. Now, if you are using TypeScript, there's two helpful types that you can make, which will help in using Redux throughout your entire application. So the first is export type root state. And this is just helpful so that your entire application knows the different variables inside Redux. So we'll say is equal to return type of store.get state. And this should be small store. This should be type of. Now, don't worry what this means. You can just use it later on and it'll just help with TypeScript in your application. And then we have export type app dispatch, and this will help in creating actions later on. So we'll say type of store.dispatch type of, and save that. So that's it. We've created the store for our Redux application. There's no data inside it as of now, but we have the shell set up so we can add stuff later on. Now, as I mentioned, Redux can be used with any framework like React or Angular, but you need a separate library to actually connect the two. So right now we just have Redux. We need to install something so that it can connect with React. So we'll go down here and say npm install react-redux. And this is kind of a bridge between React and Redux. We'll run npm run dev again. Now we need this store to be available throughout our entire application and to any component in our application. So what we'll do is we'll go into main.tsx, and what we want to do is wrap our app inside a provider. So we'll import provider from react-redux, and we'll just wrap our application inside it. And what this basically does is that it injects the store into our application. And to tell React Redux what store to use, we'll just say store is equal to store, which is what we just made in the previous step. So now the store that we made will be available in any component that we want. So right now our store is empty and we want to actually add some data to Redux. And the first thing we can do is work on the score state over here. So we want to keep track of the score over here. And if we do plus, we want to increment it, minus is decrement, and then submit we'll deal with later on. So since we're dealing with the score component, we should just create the data for this inside this folder. So we'll go ahead over here and create a score slice.ts file. And this is where the definition of any state related to the score will be held. So firstly, let's define what that state will look like. So we'll say interface score state. And again, if you're using JavaScript, you don't need to do this. We'll say the score will be a number, and that's what we'll keep track of for this component. And we'll give it an initial value. So we'll say const initial state type of score state is equal to score is 0. So whenever your app gets loaded, this variable will have a score of 0. Now we need to actually create the slice. So because if you remember, the store is like a database and a slice is like a table. So we'll say const score slice is equal to create slice, import that from Redux.js, and it takes in an object. Firstly is a name, you can give it anything. So over here we'll give it a name of score. We'll pass in the initial state, and then you need to define the different reducers you'll have for this state. Again, reducers take in any action, modify the state, and then save the state again. So the first reducer we want is for clicking on the plus button. So we'll name that increase. What that will be is a function which takes in the current state, and it does state.score plus equal 1. Now I did say that the state is immutable and it's not modifiable, and over here it looks as if we're modifying it, but that's only because Redux toolkit in the backend is modifying this into whatever code is actually needed by Redux. So we can just say this and it'll work as intended. We need another reducer, so we call that decrease. It'll take in the state, it'll do state.score minus equals 1, and we'll save that. So we have the slice defined and we have the reducers related to it defined as well. Now we just go to the bottom and we'll say export default score slice dot reducer, and that exports the reducer, and we connect it by going into store.ts and saying for score use the score slice, and save that. And automatically your score is connected to the store. Now Redux knows that we're keeping track of something called score, and it has two operations, increase and decrease, which it can handle, and those will change the values and how. But the thing is, we don't know how to trigger these changes. And if you remember, we can trigger them by calling actions. And all we need to do for creating the actions is say export const increase and decrease, and that is equal to score slice dot actions. So the score slice over here is being made using create slice, and that's giving us back not only the reducers for our slice, but as well as the actions. And we're exporting that and calling them increase and decrease. So now we have our state, we have our reducers, and we have our action. Now all we need to do is connect it to the UI. So we'll go into score.tsx and actually use it. So first let's make this number over here connected to it. So we'll go and say const score is equal to use selector, which is a function from React Redux. It takes in the state, which is the current state, and it's of type root state, which we defined inside our store.ts. And we assign it to state.score, and then the actual variable is also called score. And then instead of rendering 0, we render score over here and save. Of course, nothing changes. We need to be able to click these buttons and that will change the number. So the second thing we need to do is create a dispatch function. So const dispatch is equal to use dispatch, and that's from React Redux. And we'll give it a type because we've defined the type in our store.ts, and that's equal to app dispatch. Again, if you're in JS, you don't need to do this. And now we can call this dispatch function to create any action we want that we've already defined. So in the minus button, we'll say dispatch, and the function we want to dispatch is decrease, which we defined inside score slice. And the same way over here, we want to dispatch a function, and the function we want to dispatch is increase, which we just defined. And we save that. And now hopefully the plus and minus button should change the number. And we see that if we click on them, they do change the number and can go in the negatives as well. Now that's only one part of the equation, because when we click on submit, we also want to insert it into the history over here. And since history is its own component and it looks like it has its own data as well, we'll create a separate slice for it. So we'll go into the history component folder and create a new file called history slice.ts. We'll do the same thing we did last time. So interface history state, and say history is an array of numbers, because that's what it looks like over here, just an array of numbers. We'll say const initial state of type history state, and say it's equal to history, and it's an empty array to begin with. Then we'll say const history slice is equal to create slice, as we did before. The name will be history. We'll pass in the initial state, and then for the reducers, we just want one, which is insert. So what it will do is take in the current state, and then we'll create the arrow function. Now the thing is, previously when we were increasing or decreasing the number, we just knew it had to be increased or decreased by 1. But in this case, when we're inserting a new number into the history, we actually need what number to insert. And for that, each action has a payload to it as well, which we discussed in the previous sections. And the reducers also take it in as a parameter. So we'll say comma and say action. Its type is payload action from Redux.js toolkit, and the type will be an object of score number. And if you're wondering why it's just because in the actions, that's how we'll send it, which we'll see later. So what we do here is say state.history is equal to an array where we take an action.payload.score, which we're getting from this action variable here. And then we spread the rest of the state.history, which we had previously. And we'll save that. And similarly, we'll say export default history slice dot reducer, and let's also export the function. So export const insert is equal to history slice dot actions. So we'll go into the history component, and as we did before, first let's render the variable. So we'll say const history is equal to use selector, takes in the state of type root state, and we say state dot history, and we need to import root state. And we haven't connected our slice to our store, so we'll go into store.ts and we'll say for history connected to the history slice. Now let's actually use that value. So in history.tsx, inside this div, let's say history.map, get the current item and the current index, return a div, the key is equal to the ID, class name is equal to history dash score, close out the div, and inside here just render the item. And let's delete these. And of course it's empty for now because it starts off with an empty array. Now we need to actually call that insert action which we had defined, and we'll do that via this submit button. So as you can see, we've defined the action and history slice, but we can use it anywhere inside our entire component. So in score.tsx, inside the handle submit function over here, we'll say dispatch, we'll call the insert function from history slice, and we'll insert the score. And we'll wrap that in an object because it should be an object as we had defined before. And now if we see, we can add the number And if we submit, it gets added to the history over here. Increase it again, and we can add it again. Now, one thing you'll notice is that the score isn't being emptied out once we add it to the history, and ideally it would be. And one way you could do it is create a new reducer called clear score or something like that over here, and then call it when the submit button is clicked. But the correct way to do things is that we already have an action which is being called when we click the button, and the action is the insert action. So what if we could listen to that insert action inside our score slice and call a reducer based on that? So the reducer would cache this action and automatically clear out this value. That's how you would ideally do it in a production app as well, so that you're not duplicating code and everything is interconnected in the way it should be. So to do that, the create slice object takes in another field called extra reducers, and over here you put reducers which don't need corresponding actions. So of course in the score slice you don't need an action for clearing out the value because the history slice is taking care of that. So in that we take a builder variable. You don't need to know what that does. All you need to do is say builder dot add case, and then over here what you need to do is add in whichever action you want to catch. So we want to catch the insert action from the history slice, and what we want to do is take in the state and say state dot score is equal to 0 and save that. So let's increase this and click on submit. And you'll see just by adding these few lines of code, the same action is also clearing out this value. It might not seem much, but in a bigger application, it'll make your life a lot easier. By the way, if you're liking the video until now, do consider leaving a like and do consider joining the Discord linked in the description and comments down below, where you can meet other developers like yourself, ask any questions that you have, get some development assistance, and leave any feedback if you have it. So till now we've been working with everything contained inside our front-end application, but in a real-world app, you'll be working with APIs and making API requests, and you'll probably have to wait for some data to be fetched before you can store it inside your reducer. And async work like this works slightly differently from what we've worked on until now. So let's make a small modification. When you click on the submit button, instead of directly adding the number over here, what we'll first do is make an API call to a dummy API. And once that succeeds, we'll add the number over here. And that's a good emulation of how your application will work. So since we're dealing with the history object over here, let's go into history slice. And if you want to make an action which is async, async meaning it works with some API where you don't know when the data will be returned back. Instead of creating it inside the create slice over here, you come over here and you say const export const submit score. You could name this anything, any action you want to do. And you want to use a function called create async thunk. And the first field it will take is the name of your action. And the naming convention for this is the slice that you're using. So history in this case, slash, and then the action, submit score. Behind the scenes, that's how every action that we've made until now has been named. We just can't see it. In this case, we need to name it like this on our own. So that's the name of the action. And then the second one is an async function. So async, we'll take in a score, because keep in mind we're calling this action and passing in a value to it. So we'll take in the score, and the type will be of type score, which is a number. And again, if you're using JavaScript, you don't need to do this. And then we'll create the function over here. I'll just paste in a dummy request to an API. So we're just doing await, calling the fetch function, sending some data to this API. And then once that's done, we're just doing response.json. And then let's just do .then res console.log res, just so that we know when this request is done. And then finally, we can do return score. In an actual application, you'll probably do something like const final score is equal to await a response from the API and then return the final score. But here we'll just pass in the score that we have already. So let's save that. And now that we have the action defined, we need to connect it back into our history slice because it's not connected right now in any way whatsoever. And for this as well, we will use the extra reducers property, which we just saw. If you remember, it takes in a builder, and you do builder dot add case. Now, if you're using an async method, there'll be multiple cases you need to take into account. So firstly, we'll do submit score dot fulfilled. And this is a case where you made an API request and everything came back properly. There was no error. So in this case, we'll make a function. The first will be the state, and then secondly will be an action of type payload action. And for the type, we'll say it's an object which takes in a score and a number. And for this, we'll create the function. And we'll firstly console.log request successful, and we'll say state.history, basically what we did on top over here, and we'll do that instead and save. But this isn't the only case you need to account for. So firstly, if you want to add another case, just go to the previous .add case and at the end run another add case to it. Now another case you'll need to take care of is submit score.pending. So in a real world application, you might have a loading state when some data is being loaded or some data is being sent, and you want to show like a loading text or a spinning icon. So in this case, you would change the state while your API request is pending. For our case, we'll just say console.log sending data. And then the last case you probably want to take into account is submit score.rejected. And this is a case where there was some kind of server error or you sent a request to the wrong server and you get back an error. So in this case, we'll just console.log error submitting data, but you probably want to show like an error notification or something. So now we have our action and we have connected it to Redux by using this extra reducers object inside the create slice. And now comes the question of how to call this action, and it's quite simple actually. You go into score.tsx. So we go into the handle submit function, and instead of calling the insert function, we'll just say call the submit score function instead and send the score and save that. So before we do anything, let's open up the console so we can see what's being logged out. Let's add in a number, click on submit. You'll see there was some delay. We first logged sending data, we logged out the data, and then we had request successful. And then the data was added into our history. And there you go. That's how you do async actions in Redux. It's a very simple example, but the same logic applies for anything that you want to do, such as logging in or fetching data to render onto your page. Now, there's one last thing I want to show you, which will make your life a lot easier when you're using Redux, and that's called the Redux DevTools. So the Redux DevTools are an extension for your browser, which you can get from the Chrome store or any other store. And whenever you have an application which uses Redux, you can open it up, and it's useful because it keeps a track of your state throughout time. So let's just do some actions. We'll do plus plus plus, and we click on submit, and we see that the history shows up. If we open the Redux DevTools, you'll see that it has an entire history of everything we did. So it'll show you firstly the current state of the history, which is an array with 3 as an item inside it. But on the left hand side, it'll also show you the actions you did. So initially we had, so this is the init state and everything was 0 at this point. Then what we did was inside the score slice, we call the increase action. And again, this keeps in track with the naming convention I mentioned earlier. So we go here and we see that we changed the score from 0 to 1. We then did score increase again from 1 to 2. Score increase again 2 to 3. Then inside the history slice, we called submit score and we called the pending action because the API call was pending and no change in state. But then the submit score fulfilled was called when the API actually returned a value and our history state was changed. So as you can see, you can go through the entire steps or whatever you did, and Redux keeps a track of it. You can also go back in time by clicking on jump, and you can see that whatever is actually in the UI also gets changed. You can also use these arrows over here to go back in time and go forward in time, and you can see that the UI is getting changed as we go forward and backward. So this extension is really useful, and I highly recommend it if you're going to work with Redux and React. So that's pretty much all you need to know to get started with using Redux in your own applications. It might seem a bit complex initially, but if you just rewatch this video again and try implementing the project without looking at the video, I think you'll have a much better understanding of Redux. And once you use it in actual applications and try to make stuff by yourself, it'll be a lot easier and you'll know it like the back of your hand. Until next time, do consider subscribing and let me know down below in the comments what topic you'd like me to cover next. Thanks.